Hello everyone. So in this session, we'll be discussing about raising of funds. So raising of funds is a very important part in setting up of a startup or a business. As we all know, fund is the most important part of a business, the lifeblood, and therefore raising of fund is done very seriously in case of startups and business. So there are various sources we use to raise funds for a business or startup. So raising of these funds individually or personally is really difficult and risky. So there are various sources that enable us to raise funds so that we could easily bring up our startup or business organizations. For upcoming entrepreneurs and startups, it is really important to know what are the various sources of business or sources of fund that we use in our business. So rather than getting into the sources, it is really important to know why and how they are important in the business. So in this session, we'll be discussing about raising of funds. So let us move into the topic. The first one is seed funding. As we all know, as the name suggests, seed funding is an investment that a startup or an entrepreneurship that receives at an early stage or its blooming stage, and it helps it grow and scale its operations accordingly. So in exchange for this money, the investors who provide fund for the organization usually take the equity of the organization, which basically means they receive a percentage of the company's ownership. So seed funding is really important and a very effective source of fund that we could use for blooming stage of our entrepreneurship or startups. Therefore, it is really important to find out where and how this seed funding works. So being a source of funding, startups need a very good seed funding for their initial blooming up. So seed funding is one of the most important source of funding for startups. So getting into the importance of seed funding. So seed funding is important for our companies in multiple reasons. For example, it helps in covering up the expenses of the business, reducing the risk that the founders have. We know that founders have a huge risk in investing personally or individually. Therefore, by seed funding, they would be able to raise funds more securely and at a less risk so that they could concentrate more on the operational side of the business rather than being in a risky side of business finance. So seed funding helps and talent and growth hiring too. So we know that a startup or a business requires a lot of talent in employees. So hiring this talent is very much expensive these days and their training too are really expensive. So seed funding helps in training and hiring of these talents into the organization so that they can grow much bigger. They are also eligible for split of profit as in this way. So as we have told that the seed funding, it takes up a certain percentage of ownership of the business too. The next thing is that talking about how much you should raise as seed money or seed fund. The answer is as much as possible because for an organization or for an entrepreneur, it is really important to have fund. So seed funding is one of the most secure or a very feasible amount of funding or the source that an entrepreneur or a startup initiator could take up. Therefore, raising a fund as much as possible from seed fund is very essential. Rather than getting into individual or personal funds, it is really important to have seed funding for every business organizations for their betterment. So this is all about seed funding. I hope seed funding, the source of finance, is clear for everyone. So let us move to the next source of funding. Bootstrapping. It is really different from seed funding. It is also called as self-funding. As in case of seed funding, we know that a certain amount of our percentage of our ownership is shifted to the investors. Whereas in case of bootstrapping, it is really good way to retain 100% control of your company. If as an investor or the if as an entrepreneur or a startup initiator, you need the control of your company wholly without giving any ownership to anyone, it is proper and well sufficient to have self-funding. So, bootstrapped companies have a relatively slower progression as compared to well-funded companies. This is because there may be risk associated with raising funds individually or personally. Therefore, the progress or development of the organization or the startup must be in a slower progression than compared to a well-funded companies through these other sources. Therefore, the progression must be little slower. So it makes it possible through organically growing it and reduces stress on the founders that comes with having to pay back a loan. We know that in case of self-funding, we have a much relief that we doesn't have to pay back or the stress on payback is reduced in the mind of founders. That gives him more confidence and this will enable to work properly on the operational side of the organization. Therefore, bootstrapping is rather different from seed funding. It helps in retaining the control of your business and also growing it in a slower progression but much effectively and reduces the stress of the founders too. So the control is retained accordingly in bootstrapping. So I hope bootstrapping, the source of finance for startups and entrepreneurship, is clear for everyone. So let us move into the next one. So the next source of funding for business is angel investors. So we know that angel investors, as the name suggests, they are merely very wealthy individuals who take an interest in early startups and want them to join them along their journey. So they invest much less in comparison with venture capitalists who take up large percentage of the company or its ownership. That's why angel investing is preferred for early startups. Angel investing is much preferred than venture capital or any other form of startup funding because they take up much less ownership of the companies and also invest less. So this helps the coming up entrepreneurs to have more control over their business and to concentrate more on the operational efficiency. So many successful companies like we know, Google, Yahoo, Alibaba have got their start through angel investments. So it is really important to have a clear-cut idea on what angel investors are, how they help the organization to grow, and how they take part in the journey of a blooming organization. So it is said that these angel investors are individuals who have a quite good interest in the startups. So they'll get along with the journey by funding the startups as many successful companies have taken this angel investing as their source of funding for their growth. We know that angel investors and investment is very useful for organizations to grow and bloom up. So especially in their early stage of start. So I hope angel investors are clear for everyone. So let us move into the next source of funding for startups. Venture capitalists. As mentioned in the earlier slide, we know that angel investors and venture capitalists are totally different. This is a big league of funding where venture capitalists are professionally managed funds of individuals who invest large sum of money in companies with a high growth profile or potential. This is said that venture capital mostly invest in high potential growth companies. So they pool up the amount from various individuals and have a large amount and they invest in very potentially growth able companies so that they get much weighted profits and more profits for their investors accordingly. Therefore, venture capitalists take up a large share of ownership of the businesses. Therefore, it is quite inconvenient that the ownership of your firm might be diluted rather than angel investors or seed funding. And I hope venture capitalist is clear for everyone. So let us move to the next source of funding. Crowdfunding. Crowdfunding is the process of raising small amount of money from large number of people, most of whom are unknown to the founders. It can be done in various ways such as taking a loan, pre-ordering, contributions, investment, etc. So crowdfunding is much different form of source of funding where all small amounts of investors are collected collectively together by companies or intermediaries and given to institutions or startups for their growth in certain way of loan with an interest rate or pre-ordering or contribution or investment criteria. That is about the crowdfunding, which is really different from venture capitalists, seed funding or angel investors. So that is about crowdfunding, a very famous source of funding startups or business in their career stage. So the next one is incubators. Incubators or accelerators, it is also known as accelerators, which provide assistance to hundreds of startups, really many startups, for nurturing their business with right tools for them to sustain themselves. So rather than just providing fund, incubators provide various tools that the startups and organizations could use to develop themselves and bloom into a better stage. Therefore, incubators are much used and interested source of funding for startups. So these are several funds or source of funds that is used by the startups for their purpose of getting into development and operational efficiency. So some of them are used in the early stage, where some of them are used for the entire life of the business. For example, like venture capital that helps the organization to grow accordingly in various stages of the organization. So we have studied about angel investors, incubators, venture capitalists, seed funding, crowdfunding, bootstrapping, and all these startup funding providers are very essential and important to be known by any person or startup initiator or entrepreneurs for raising their fund. As we have said earlier, raising fund individually or personally is much risk-taking process. Therefore, it would be so good and important to have certain source of fund and its information to raise funds accordingly. So, in this session, we have discussed about various sources of funding for entrepreneurship or startups. And I hope all these sources of funds are clear for everyone. So, this is about the session raising of funds for startups. Thank you.